She didn't knock. Eleanor Cross put her shoulder into the door of a stranger's ranch house and fell straight through it, landing on her hands and knees on the wooden floor with a wanted poster crumpling in her fist, her own face staring back at her, the word "murderous" printed in letters big enough to read from a moving horse. The man standing over her with a rifle didn't shoot. He just looked at the poster, looked at her, and said the 4 words that changed everything. "That drawing doesn't do you justice." Now, before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to our channel and stay with me until the very last word. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Eleanor's story travels. Every single comment means the world to us. Now let's go back to that doorway to that winter night in Montana and find out how a wanted woman and a man with too many secrets became the most dangerous partnership in the territory. The wanted poster had been nailed to every tree between Harlan Creek and the Idaho border, and Eleanor Cross had torn down every single one she could reach. It didn't matter. There were always more. She'd been riding for 11 days when the horse gave out. Not dramatically, no stumble, no fall. Just a long, exhausted slowdown until the animal simply stopped walking and stood in the middle of a snow-covered road with its head dropped and its sides heaving, done with the whole enterprise entirely. Ellie couldn't blame her. She felt exactly the same way. "I know," she said to the horse. "I know, girl. Just a little further." The horse did not move. The snow was coming sideways now, the kind of Montana winter wind that didn't just chill you, but argued with you, pushed back against every step like it had a personal grievance. Ellie's fingers had stopped feeling real things about an hour ago. She could see them wrapped around the reins, but she couldn't feel them. She'd been wearing her late husband's coat, the heavy wool one he'd bought in Chicago, and never wore, because Franklin Cross had not been a man who spent time outdoors, and even that wasn't enough anymore. She looked up the road. Darkness and snow, and more darkness. She looked behind her. The same, plus the distant memory of lantern light from the last town she'd passed through, the one where she'd seen her own face on that poster, and kept her head down and walked straight through without stopping. Wanted for murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. Eleanor Grace Cross. $500 reward. $500. Franklin hadn't been worth $500 alive and apparently dead. He was worth considerably more, at least, to the men who'd put that poster up. The men who'd actually killed him. The men whose names were on none of the paperwork, but whose hands were on all of the decisions. She knew their names. That was the problem. That was why she was standing in a Montana blizzard with a horse that had quit, and fingers she couldn't feel, instead of sitting in a warm St. Louis parlor, grieving her husband like a proper widow. "All right," she said to no one. "All right." She tied the horse to a fence post she almost missed in the dark, pulled the saddlebag over her shoulder, and started walking toward the only light she could see. A faint yellow glow, maybe a quarter mile up a rise, the kind that meant a window and a fire, and possibly a human being who hadn't yet decided to shoot her on sight. She made it about 200 yards before her left boot went through the ice crust over a ditch, and she went down hard, hitting her palms and one knee on frozen ground, and lay there for a moment, just breathing her breath coming out in hard white clouds, the snow falling on her face with complete indifference to her situation. Get up, she told herself. The way she'd been telling herself to get up for 11 days. The way she'd told herself to get up on the morning she'd found Franklin with 2 bullets in his chest, and a note pinned to his jacket that read, "This is what happens to men who get greedy," written in a hand she didn't recognize. The way she'd told herself to get up when the sheriff had looked at her with that particular expression men wore when they'd already made up their minds and were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She got up. The walk up the rise took longer than it should have. By the time she reached the porch, she couldn't feel her feet either, and the saddlebag felt like it was full of stones. And somewhere in the last 50 yards, she'd made peace with the very real possibility that the person on the other side of that door would recognize her face from the poster, and she would spend the rest of the night in a barn under guard instead of somewhere warm. At that point, the barn sounded acceptable. She didn't knock. That was the thing she'd think about later. The fact that she hadn't knocked, that her arm just gave out when she reached for the handle, and her weight did the rest, and the door of Thomas Weston's ranch house swung inward, and Eleanor Cross fell through it and landed on her hands and knees on his wooden floor. The wanted poster had been folded in her coat pocket. It fell out when she hit the floor and opened itself like it wanted to be seen, her own face looking up at her from the floorboards. Murderous in big black letters. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of a rifle being cocked, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of a man who had done this before and wasn't rattled by the necessity of it. "Don't move," he said. "I'm not moving," she said into the floor. "I'm not capable of moving." A pause. Then boots on the floorboards, slow and careful, coming closer. She felt him crouch beside her. Felt him pick up the poster. The silence that followed was the longest kind. "That drawing doesn't do you justice," he said finally. She turned her head and looked up at him. He was lean and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that wasn't exactly handsome, but was absolutely worth looking at. He was holding the rifle loosely now, not pointed at her, just held the way a man holds a tool he's used to carrying. He was looking at the poster. Then he looked at her. Then back at the poster. "It makes me look desperate," she said. "You're lying on my floor in the middle of a blizzard," he said. "How's that working out?" "I'm aware of the irony." He stood, set the rifle against the wall, not so far that he couldn't reach it, but against the wall. "Can you stand?" "Probably not immediately." "Try." She tried. Made it to her knees before her left leg decided it was done cooperating, and she grabbed the edge of a chair and hauled herself upright by sheer stubbornness, her wet hair falling across her face, her whole body shaking with a cold that had gone all the way to the bone. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was going in the stone hearth behind him, throwing heat and orange light across the room, and she wanted to walk toward it with a desperation she hadn't felt about anything in 11 days of running. "You're Eleanor Cross," he said. Not a question. "I'm aware of that too. The poster says you murdered your husband." "The poster says a lot of things." He studied her face. Something moved in his expression. Not sympathy, not suspicion, something more careful than either. "Did you?" The question sat in the air between them. She'd been asked it before. By the sheriff in St. Louis, in exactly that tone, with exactly that expression, the one that said the answer didn't really matter, because the story was already written. She'd said no, and it hadn't made a difference. She said it again anyway. "No." He nodded slowly, just once. "Go stand by the fire before you fall down again." She went. She stood with her back to him, and her face to the flames, and let the heat hit her like something physical. And her hands started hurting as they thawed, which was actually a good sign, because it meant they still worked. And she stood there, and breathed, and tried to figure out where she was, and what she was going to do, and how long it would be before this man decided the $500 reward was more interesting than whatever scraps of decency were making him hesitate. She heard him moving behind her, heard the sound of a pot being set on the stove. "Sit down," he said. "The chair to your left." She sat. He put coffee in front of her a few minutes later and took the chair on the other side of the table and sat with his own cup and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. "I'm Wade Weston," he said. "This is my land. 240 acres cattle, I run it alone." He paused. "I used to be a Pinkerton detective." The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Past tense," he said. "I quit 4 years ago, but I know how to read a wanted poster, Mrs. Cross, and I know the difference between a woman who killed her husband and a woman who's being blamed for it." The heat from the fire, the heat from the coffee, the warmth slowly coming back into her hands. None of it prepared her for the way those words landed. She had not heard anyone say those words in 11 days. She had not heard anyone speak them out loud as if they were a real possibility and not a convenient excuse. Her throat tightened. She set the cup down carefully before she could spill it. "And which am I?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The second kind." He looked at her over his cup. The poster was filed out of the 3rd District Court in St. Louis. Judge is a man named Alderman Taft. Taft has been in Senator Harold Briggs's pocket for going on 6 years. Meg. He said it the way someone says a thing they've known for a long time, a fact worn smooth from handling. "Your husband was a lawyer. He worked for Briggs Land Acquisition Company before he died, and now you're wanted for his murder." He set down his cup. "So I'm going to ask you a question. Mrs. Cross and I need the truth. What did your husband tell you before he died?" The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the windows. "He didn't tell me anything," she said. "He was already dead when I found him." "What did you find on him?" She looked at the stranger across the table. This former Pinkerton man who'd looked at her poster and said, "I know the difference," and meant it. Who hadn't locked her in the barn. Who'd given her coffee and a chair by the fire and was asking her questions that assumed she had useful information, rather than questions that assumed she was guilty. She reached into the saddlebag and put the leather document folder on the table between them. She watched his face when he opened it. He was still for a long time. He turned each page carefully, the way a man handles something he knows is important. He read each document twice. The fire made the only sound in the room. "Where did you get these?" he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "They were sewn into the lining of Franklin's coat, the one I've been wearing." She paused. "I didn't find them until the 3rd day of riding. I felt something stiff when I was wringing out the sleeves." "Do you know what these are?" "Deed transfers. False ones, I think. Land belonging to 43 different families in the northern counties transferred through shell companies to something called Montana Territory Holdings." She'd had 8 days to study every page. "I know Harold Briggs' name is on 6 of these as a witness. I know my husband's signature is on all of them. And I know at least 3 of those signatures are forged because I watched Franklin sign documents for 10 years, and his name doesn't form the capital C like that." Wade Weston looked up at her. "You've been carrying evidence of the largest land fraud in Montana Territory history," he said, "across 11 days, and God knows how many miles in a dead man's coat with your face on a wanted poster." "Yes." "And you knocked on my door." "I fell through your door." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Mrs. Cross, these documents are enough to bring down a sitting senator and a circuit court judge and at least 1 member of the Territorial Land Office." He closed the folder carefully. "They are also enough to get you killed inside of 48 hours if the wrong person finds out you have them." "I know that," she said. "Then you understand that leaving here tomorrow isn't an option." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that whoever killed your husband is not going to stop looking for these." He tapped the folder. "And you've had them for 11 days, which means if they have any competence at all, they've tracked you this far by now. You go back out on that road alone, you'll be dead before you reach the next county." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm offering you shelter and protection while we figure out how to use these documents in a way that doesn't get both of us killed." "Why?" The word came out before she could stop it. "You don't know me. I'm a wanted woman with a $500 reward. Why would you take that risk?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice lost the careful detective tone and became something else, something older. "I worked for the Pinkerton agency for 9 years, he said. "I was good at it. Good enough that they trusted me with jobs that needed to be done quietly. One of those jobs was following a group of mining families in Colorado who were organizing against a company that owed them back wages." He looked at the fire. "I filed my reports. The company used them to identify the organizers. 11 men lost their jobs. 3 of them lost their homes. One of them had a daughter who was 8 years old and ended up in an orphanage in Denver because there was nobody left to care for her." He paused. "I quit the next morning, bought this land, And I have spent 4 years trying to figure out how to be a different kind of man than the one who filed those reports." The fire crackled. "So," he said, turning back to her, "that's why." Eleanor Cross looked at this former detective with his careful eyes and his quiet guilt, and his hand resting on a folder full of documents that could burn down half the power structure of Montana Territory. She thought about 11 days of running. She thought about the horse she'd tied to a fence post in a blizzard, and the boot that had gone through the ice, and the 200 yards she'd crawled up a rise toward a light she wasn't even sure was real. She thought about Franklin's coat, and what had been sewn into its lining, and what it meant that he'd hidden it there, not in a safe, not with a lawyer, but on his own body, hidden with the particular desperation of a man who knew he was running out of time. He'd known they were coming for him, and he'd hidden the one thing that could stop them, where no one would think to look until it was too late. Or until someone like Eleanor found it. "My horse is tied to your fence post," she said. "I'll bring her in. She's exhausted. She needs water and—" "I know how to care for a horse, Mrs. Cross." He stood and took his coat from the hook by the door. "There's a room at the end of the hall. Clean sheets. Lock works from the inside." He paused with his hand on the door. "Nobody's coming tonight in this weather. Get warm. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning. And if I decide to leave in the morning—" He looked back at her. "Then I'll point you toward Harlan Creek and wish you the best. But Lydia—" He stopped, looked at her directly. "Mrs. Cross, I've seen 3 of those shell company names before, on land filings right here in this county. What's happening to those 43 families in the Northern Territories?" He let that sit for a moment. "It's already happening here too. I just didn't have the piece that connected it all." He opened the door. The blizzard roared in around him, cold and immediate and absolute. "Until you fell through my door," he said. Then he went out into the snow. Eleanor Cross sat at the table for a long moment after he left. The fire burned steadily. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the wind hammered at the windows with the insistence of something that had a point to make. She pulled the folder toward her and opened it again, looking at the pages she'd memorized. 43 families, 43 plots of land. Franklin's forged signature repeated over and over, with the mechanical certainty of a man who had stopped thinking about what the documents meant and focused only on how quickly he could finish and get paid. She wondered not for the first time how much he'd known. Whether the Franklin who'd hidden these documents in his coat lining had been a different man than the Franklin who'd signed them. Whether fear had finally made him honest, or whether honest had never been the right word for Franklin Cross, and she'd spent 7 years of marriage not knowing who she was actually talking to. She heard the barn door open and close. The sound of a man taking care of a horse that wasn't his in a blizzard because a woman he didn't know had tied it to his fence post. She closed the folder and held it against her chest and sat in the warmth of a stranger's fire and thought about 43 families and 1 little girl in a Denver orphanage and a former Pinkerton detective who'd been trying for 4 years to figure out how to be a different kind of man. She thought about Senator Harold Briggs, who had put her face on a wanted poster and a $500 price on her head, and who had, in doing so, made the catastrophic error of assuming that a woman running for her life was a woman who had nothing left to fight with. He didn't know about the coat, he didn't know about the folder, and he didn't know about the man currently coming back through the front door with snow on his shoulders and straw on his boots, stamping his feet on the threshold, and hanging his coat on the hook, and saying without looking at her, "She's fine. Good horse. Tough." "She is," Ellie said. Wade Weston went to pour himself fresh coffee. He set the pot back on the stove and stood with his back to her for a moment. And when he turned around, there was something decided in his expression, something that hadn't been there before or hadn't been visible before. "Those documents," he said. "I need you to understand something before morning." "Tell me." "There's a land office clerk in Harlan Creek, name of Samuel Pruitt. He's been filing the local versions of exactly what's in that folder for 8 months. I've been watching him, but I had nothing solid." He looked at her steadily. I have a contact at the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. A man I trust, one of maybe 4 people left in this territory I can say that about. If we can get copies of what you're carrying to him before Briggs finds out where you are, we have a chance to bring this to a federal level where Briggs's local connections can't bury it. How long would that take? A week. Maybe 10 days if the weather holds bad. And in the meantime, he said, you're Ellie Weston, my wife's cousin from Billings, visiting while the weather's bad. He held up a hand before she could respond. I know, but a single woman sheltering alone with a bachelor rancher will bring every gossip in Harlan Creek to this door inside of 48 hours, and right now, the last thing we need is attention. She looked at him. You think of everything. It's what I was trained for. Something crossed his face. For better or worse. She should have argued. She knew how to argue. Franklin had been fond of saying she could win a debate with a fence post. She had 17 separate reasons why walking into a small Montana town claiming to be this man's relation was a terrible idea, starting with the fact that she'd be recognized, and ending with the fact that she had no idea who Thomas Wade Weston actually was beneath the quiet exterior and the guilty conscience and the coffee he'd made without being asked. But she thought about 43 families. She thought about the child in Denver. She thought about Senator Harold Briggs with his hand-appointed judges and his shell companies and the casual, practiced ease with which he'd had a man killed and his widow framed for it before the body was even cold. Ellie Weston, she said, trying the name. Just for the town, he said. In this house, you're Eleanor Cross. What you are is what you are, and I won't pretend otherwise. She looked at this stranger across his table in his house with his fire warming her back and his coffee in front of her and his rifle leaned against the wall at a careful distance that said, I trust you enough to put it down, but I'm not naive. She looked at the folder between them and the 43 names inside it, and the dead man's signature repeated over and over like a confession. She thought about what it meant that Wade Weston had been watching Samuel Pruitt for 8 months, that he'd known something was wrong before she'd ever fallen through his door, that she hadn't found a safe harbor by accident, she'd found the one man in Montana territory who'd already been pulling at the same thread from the other end. Franklin had hidden the documents in his coat, and somehow, without knowing any of it, Eleanor Cross had walked them straight to the one person who knew what to do with them. All right, she said. 10 days. He nodded once, the same way she imagined he'd done everything without excess, without ceremony, with the particular economy of a man who'd learned a long time ago that most words were wasted. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow I'll ride to the edge of the property and check for tracks. If they've followed you this far, I'll know by morning. She stood, picked up the folder, held it for a moment. Wade, she said. He looked up. If this goes wrong, she started. It won't. But if it does, if Briggs gets to us before we get to Helena. She held the folder out to him. You keep these. You know what to do with them better than I do. You've been doing this longer. He looked at the folder, looked at her, made no move to take it. You carried them 11 days, he said. Across 3 states, in a dead man's coat, in a blizzard with your face on every tree. His voice was very quiet. You keep them, Mrs. Cross. They're yours. You earned them. She lowered her arm, tucked the folder back against her chest. The fire burned between them, warm and steady and indifferent to everything that was coming. And Eleanor Cross stood in a stranger's house in the middle of a Montana blizzard, and felt for the first time in 11 days something that was not quite hope, but was the shape of where hope goes when it's building itself back from nothing. She turned and walked down the hall to the room at the end. The lock worked from the inside, just like he'd said. She didn't use it. She slept harder than she had in 11 days, which wasn't saying much because the 11 days before had involved barn floors and frozen creek banks, and one terrible night in a root cellar outside of Billings, where something small and determined had spent 3 hours trying to get through the wall. But she slept, And when she woke, the light coming under the door was the thin gray of early morning, and she lay still for a moment, just listening to the silence, checking it, the way she'd learned to check silences over 11 days of running for the quality of it, whether it was empty or waiting. It was empty. Just the sound of wind that had lost most of its fury overnight and the distant low complaint of cattle somewhere outside. She dressed in the same clothes she'd been wearing for 3 days because there was nothing else, pulled Franklin's coat over everything, and went down the hall. Wade was already at the table with a cup of coffee and a map spread out in front of him, and mud on his boots that hadn't been there last night. He'd been out already. She looked at his face and knew before she asked. "You found tracks," she said. "2 sets. Coming up the eastern road, stopping about a mile out." He didn't look up from the map. "They turned back sometime before dawn. Could be they lost the trail in the storm. Could be they're regrouping." He moved his finger along a line on the map. "There's a way station on the Harlan Creek Road about 8 miles east. Rough place. Men who don't ask questions about other men's business stay there sometimes." He looked up. "Coffee's hot." She poured herself a cup and stood at the table looking at the map. "How many people in Harlan Creek know who you are? Know what you used to do?" "Enough," he said. "I didn't exactly arrive quietly. Pinkerton men have a reputation in cattle country. Some people like it. Most don't." He folded the map with the careful efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in the field. "Ruth McAllister knows. She runs the boarding house in town. She's the one who told me about Pruitt 8 months ago, when she noticed the land filings coming through that didn't match the properties she knew. Can she be trusted? More than anyone else in that town." He picked up his cup. "She lost her own property 4 years ago, filed claim, paid her taxes, had her deed in order. Then one morning a man from the land office showed up and told her there'd been an error in the original survey, and the northern 40 acres had reverted to territorial control." He paused. "The northern 40 had the only reliable water source on the property. Without it, the rest was worthless. She sold inside of 3 months for 1/3 of what it was worth. To Montana Territory Holdings." Eleanor set down her cup. "She didn't know that name then," Wade said. "Neither did I until last night." He looked at the folder she'd placed on the table when she'd sat down. "How many of those transfers go through Montana Territory Holdings directly?" 19. The other 24 go through 2 other company names, but the deed language is identical in all of them. She opened the folder and found the page she wanted. Same clause about mineral access. Same clause about water rights reverting to the acquiring party within 60 days of transfer. Same notary stamp, a man named R.C. Holt in Cheyenne. R.C. Holt is Aldrich Stone's brother-in-law, Wade said immediately. She looked at him. "You know that I know a lot of things about how Senator Briggs operates. I've just never had anything that tied it together in one place." He nodded at the folder. "Until now." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband put these documents together himself." "I think so. I think he'd been collecting them for months. Quietly, one at a time, making copies when he could." She turned a page. "Some of these have his handwriting in the margins, notes, cross-references. He was building a case. And then someone found out." "Yes. Who else knew he was doing this?" She'd asked herself that question for 11 days, turning it over and over on every cold road and in every dark barn, and she still didn't have an answer that satisfied her. "I don't know. He didn't tell me. Franklin didn't tell me much." She paused. "I used to think that was just how he was, private, careful. Now I think he was protecting me, or trying to, keeping me separate from it, so that if something happened," her voice held where she needed it to, "so that if something happened, I wouldn't be involved." "That plan didn't work out," Wade said, not unkindly. "No." She closed the folder. "Because whoever killed him decided that a wife who might know something was more dangerous than a wife who knew nothing. And once my face was on that poster, it didn't matter whether I was innocent. Innocent women in jail can't testify. Innocent women on the run can't be believed. She looked at him directly. That's what that poster is really for. Not to find me. To ruin my credibility before I can use what I have. Wade was looking at her with that careful expression. She was starting to read the one where he was evaluating something not the way a suspicious man evaluates a suspect, but the way a precise man evaluates information, weighing it, finding where it fit. "You understand this better than most people would," he said. "I was married to a lawyer for 7 years. I listened." She picked up her coffee. "Franklin underestimated me consistently. Apparently, so did Senator Briggs." "Briggs underestimates most people," Wade said. "It's his primary weakness. He's been operating in a territory where money and political connection meant you never had to be careful, and that makes a man sloppy." He stood and took his cup to the stove. "He didn't expect your husband to turn on him. He didn't expect those documents to leave St. Louis. And he definitely didn't expect the woman he was trying to frame to be smart enough to read what she was carrying. He expected me to be running scared with no idea what I had. Instead, you're sitting at my table having already identified the notary stamp connection," he said. "Yeah." He miscalculated. She almost smiled. "Almost." "Wade," she said. "The man you mentioned in Helena, the marshal's contact. Can you get a message to him without going through the telegraph office in Harlan Creek? There's a relay rider who comes through twice a week. Passes about 3 miles north of the property. I can leave a message at the postmarker." He turned around. "Why?" "Because I want to know if there's already a federal inquiry. If someone in Washington is already looking at Briggs, then these documents become exponentially more powerful. They don't just open an investigation, they close one." She looked at the folder. "But if there's nothing federal yet, we need to think about how we present this. A territorial court won't touch it. Taft is Briggs' man. We need to go over him." Wade set down his cup slowly. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Ellie," she said. "You told the whole town I'm your cousin. You might as well use it." Ellie. He seemed to test the name, then accept it. "Where did you go to school?" The question was so far from what she'd expected that she answered it honestly before she thought about it. "Miss Hargrove's Academy in Cincinnati, then 2 years at the Ohio Female College before my father decided that was enough education for a woman with my prospects." She paused. "Why?" "Because the way you just described a federal jurisdictional strategy was more precise than anything I heard from the Pinkerton lawyers in 9 years. He said it without flattery, just observation. "I'm trying to understand who I'm working with." "You're working with a woman who had nothing to do for 7 years but read her husband's law books while he was out doing things he didn't tell her about," she said. "I read everything in that house. He had 4 shelves of legal texts, and I went through all of them because there was nothing else to do, and I have never been good at sitting still." She paused. "He thought I was reading novels." Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to ride to the relay post this morning. I want to get a message to Helena before those tracks out on the eastern road turn into riders on my property." He moved toward the door and stopped. "There's food in the kitchen. Don't go outside while I'm gone. If someone comes to the door, you're my cousin from Billings with a head cold, and you don't know anything about anything." "What's my last name?" "Holt," he said, and then stopped. "No, not Holt. Barrett. Ellie Barrett." He pulled on his coat. "And if a man named Cole Whitfield comes to the door, you have never heard of Eleanor Cross. You've been here 4 days, and you think I'm the most boring man you've ever met." "Who's Cole Whitfield?" "Samuel Pruitt's brother-in-law," Wade said. "And the man I think killed your husband." He left before she could respond, the door closing quiet and final behind him, and Eleanor Cross stood in the middle of a stranger's kitchen with the name Cole Whitfield sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through everything she thought she'd known. She had a name. After 11 days of running from a faceless threat, a poster with no author, a crime with no visible hand, she had a name. She sat down. She opened the folder and went back through every page with new eyes looking for Cole Whitfield, looking for any name that might connect to Pruitt's family, any signature that matched what she was beginning to build in her mind. Not just the shape of the fraud, but the shape of the machine that had committed it, the gears and the hands and the men who'd done the actual work, while Briggs kept his name carefully off the papers that mattered. She found it on the 14th page. A witness signature on a deed transfer dated March 1881. C. Whitfield, written in a cramped hand that leaned hard to the right like the man had been writing in a hurry. March 1881. Franklin had been working for Briggs Land Company since January of that year. She pulled out the small notebook she'd been keeping since the third day of writing and wrote down the date, the deed number, the county, the names. She'd been doing this every day, building the case the way Franklin had apparently been building it, except that Franklin had hidden his work in a coat lining, and she was going to do something different with hers. She was going to use it. She was deep into the cross-referencing when she heard the horse outside, and her whole body went still. One horse. Moving at a walk, not urgency, just approach. She got up slowly and moved toward the window at an angle so she could see out without being seen. Wade coming back across the field from the north. She let out the breath she'd been holding and went back to the table. He came in stomping snow from his boots, his face red from the cold, and he read her expression before he'd even taken off his coat. What did you find? Whitfield signed a witness on a deed in March of 1881, same month Franklin joined the company. She turned the notebook toward him. He wasn't just the man who killed Franklin. He was there from the beginning. He's been Briggs' enforcer through this entire operation. Wade sat down and looked at her notes. He was quiet for a long time. My contact in Helena, he said finally. His name is Marshal Daniel Reeves. He's been building a case against Briggs for 2 years, but he told me 8 months ago he didn't have enough to move without Briggs' people getting to the evidence before it reached a federal judge. He tapped the notebook. This is enough. What you have in that folder is enough. He looked at her. He'll want to meet you. When? Soon as we can arrange it safely. The relay rider goes out tomorrow morning. If Reeves moves fast, he could be here in 5 days. He paused. Provided nobody on that eastern road figures out where you are in the meantime. And if they do? He met her eyes without flinching. Then we have a different kind of problem. The afternoon passed in work, the deliberate, focused work of 2 people who were good at thinking and had a concrete problem in front of them. Wade pulled out his own notes from 8 months of watching Pruitt, and they laid everything side by side on the table. And slowly, the picture that had been fragments became a shape. And the shape had a center, and the center had Briggs's name on it 6 different ways. Wade was methodical. He worked through information the way she imagined he'd worked a case linearly. No assumptions, each fact earning its place before the next one got built on top of it. She was different. She saw patterns, lateral connections, the way one document's language echoed another's in ways that weren't accidental. Between the 2 of them, they moved faster than either would have alone. You did this with your husband? He asked at one point, without looking up from the page he was reading. This kind of work? No, she said. Franklin would have said I was interfering. She paused. I did it in my own head while he was talking, and sometimes I'd ask a question that happened to point somewhere useful, and he'd look at me like it was a coincidence. Wade looked up at that. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. His loss, he said simply, and went back to reading. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. It was 4 words, practical, and passing, not intended as comfort. But she felt it settle somewhere in the space where 11 days of being called a murderess had worn everything down to bone. She kept working. Around mid-afternoon she heard horses on the road, and both of them went still at the same moment, the particular simultaneous stillness of 2 people who had learned separately to listen for exactly that sound. Wade was on his feet, and at the window before she'd finished standing. 2 riders, he said quietly, stopping at the gate. He watched. They're reading the property marker. He watched another moment. Moving on. She sat back down. Her hands were steady. She noted that with something like surprise. "That'll keep happening," Wade said, returning to the table. "Until Reeves gets here, or until they make a move. They're circling, mapping the property, figuring out how many of us there are, and whether it's worth the risk." He sat. "They know you're somewhere in this area. They don't know exactly where. And they don't know about the documents yet, or there'd already be more than 2 of them. How long before they figure out exactly where? Harlan Creek has 1 hotel, 1 boarding house, 1 general store, and a sheriff who owes Pruitt 3 favors." He was matter-of-fact about it. "Somebody will talk. Somebody always talks. We have maybe 3 days before this address is on a report going back to Briggs." He paused. "Which is why tomorrow morning I'm going into town with you, and you're going to meet Ruth McAllister." She looked at him. "You said to stay off the road." "I said don't go outside alone. Going into town together is different. 2 people are harder to quietly disappear than 1. He looked at her steadily. "And Ruth needs to know what's in that folder. She's been waiting 4 years for someone to walk through this territory with proof she could use. We owe her the truth." Eleanor looked at the folder. At her 11 days of running distilled into pages of forged signatures and fraudulent deeds, and the names of 43 families who had lost what was theirs. She thought about Ruth McAllister selling her property for 1/3 of its value because the water was taken from her without warning or recourse. She thought about the way Briggs operated, not with violence first, but with paperwork, with bureaucratic quiet, with the slow grinding certainty of a machine that knew the people it was crushing, had no mechanism to fight back. She thought about Cole Whitfield's cramped signature, leaning hard to the right. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go together." Wade nodded once. He reached for the next document in the pile, and for a while there was no sound but the scratch of her pen in the notebook, and the wind outside, and the distant cattle, and the fire doing its steady, faithful work against the cold. At some point, without either of them marking it, they had stopped being a detective and a fugitive sitting across a table and had become 2 people working the same problem from the same side. And Eleanor Cross, who had not trusted anyone in 11 days, and had not had reason to trust anyone for considerably longer than that, noticed this the way you notice a change in weather, not the exact moment it shifted, but the fact that something was different now than it had been before. She kept working. So did he. Outside, the road was quiet, but not for long. Harlan Creek in winter had the particular kind of quiet that small towns get when everyone inside them is watching, but nobody wants to be caught doing it. Eleanor felt the eyes before she saw the faces, the slight movement of curtain at the general store window, the man on the hotel porch who stopped whittling just long enough to study them as they rode past the woman at the water trough who took considerably longer with her bucket than the task required. Wade rode with his shoulders easy and his eyes moving the way she'd noticed they always moved cataloging without appearing to taking in the geometry of the street and the position of every person in it, with the practiced calm of someone for whom vigilance had long since stopped feeling like effort. He tipped his hat to the woman at the trough. She nodded back and moved on, but her eyes went to Eleanor first. "Don't look at the sheriff's office," Wade said quietly, not turning his head. She didn't look at the sheriff's office. "How many people are in there right now?" she asked, equally quiet. "2. Pruitt's man and someone I don't recognize. They were watching us from the window when we turned onto Main Street." He kept his horse at the same unhurried walk. "Keep riding. Ruth's place is at the end of the block." The boarding house was a wide 2-story building with a porch that wrapped around the front and a sign that read, "A McAllister's Rooms and Board," in plain painted letters. Wade dismounted and tied his horse at the post without any change in his manner, and Eleanor followed his lead, stepping down from the mare she'd borrowed from his barn, her own horse still recovering and doing everything at exactly the speed of someone who had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to hide. The woman who met them at the door was maybe 55, built like someone who had done physical work for 30 years and intended to do 30 more, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back and eyes that moved to Eleanor's face, and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds before moving on with the decisiveness of someone who had seen enough of life to form accurate opinions quickly. "Wade," she said. "Ruth, this is my cousin Ellie down from Billings. Weather caught her here." Ruth McAllister looked at Eleanor with those 2-second eyes and said, "Come in out of the cold," which meant something more than the words themselves, and Eleanor understood that she was being extended a courtesy that had nothing to do with the cold. Inside with the door closed, Ruth turned and looked at Eleanor directly and said, "How long have you had them following you?" Eleanor blinked. 13 days now. "I saw the poster 2 days ago. Pruitt's man put one up on the telegraph pole outside." Ruth moved toward the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of a woman who dealt with complications by addressing them practically. "I took it down after dark. Seemed like the decent thing." She looked back. "Coffee?" "Please," Eleanor said. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table, the three of them, and Wade put the folder on the surface between them, and Ruth McAllister opened it with the careful hands of a woman handling something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. She turned each page slowly. She didn't speak for a long time. When she got to the deed for a property listed as McAllister Northern Parcel 40 acres with water access on the eastern boundary, transferred to Montana Territory. Holdings in October 1879, she stopped. She put her hand flat on the page. "There it is," she said, very quiet. "There it is in black and white." "Your name isn't on it," Eleanor said. "Your property is. But the deed is made out to a Victoria Ruth Strand." "That was my name before I married," Ruth said. "Before I married Jim McAllister, God rest him. I hadn't used that name in 22 years. She looked up, and her eyes were dry, but the set of her jaw was the particular expression of a woman holding something together by force of will. "How did they know that name?" "County birth records," Wade said, "or marriage records. Someone went looking." He paused. "Which means they were targeting you specifically, not just opportunistically." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Jim filed a water rights complaint against the Territorial Land Office 6 months before they came for our property. He thought there was something wrong with the way the filings were being processed. He wrote 3 letters to the land office in Helena." She took her hand off the page. "He died of a heart attack 4 months later. He was 47 years old and healthy as a man half his age." She said it without accusation, just the flat weight of a thing she'd been carrying alone for 4 years. "I always thought it was too convenient." The kitchen was very still. "Ruth," Wade said carefully, "do you still have those letters? The ones Jim wrote?" "Every one. Upstairs in a tin box under the floorboard." She stood. "I'll get them." While she was gone, Eleanor and Wade looked at each other across the table, and neither of them said anything, because sometimes the silence between two people who are thinking the same terrible thought is more honest than any words. Ruth came back with a tin box and put it on the table and opened it, and there were letters, yes, but there were also deed copies and receipts and a handwritten ledger in a man's cramped script that Eleanor recognized immediately as the same kind of careful accumulation that had been sewn into Franklin's coat lining. "Jim kept records," Ruth said. "He always kept records. Said a man who could prove what he'd said was worth 10 men who could only remember it." She touched the ledger gently. "I didn't know what to do with any of it after he died. Didn't know who to trust with it. So I just kept it." Wade opened the ledger. He read 3 pages and then said, "Ruth, your husband identified R.C. Holt by name in 1879. "I know. I read it 100 times. Didn't know who Holt was connected to. Just knew he kept appearing on documents that didn't look right to Jim." "He's the notary on every fraudulent deed in this folder," Eleanor said. "He's Aldrich Stone's brother-in-law. Stone is Senator Briggs's personal attorney." Ruth sat back in her chair with the expression of a woman watching something she'd suspected for 4 years finally take visible form. "Briggs," she said. The name came out like a word she'd been careful not to say out loud, as if saying it made it more dangerous. Briggs, Wade confirmed. He's been running this operation since at least 1879, probably longer. Your husband stumbled onto it and filed complaints and died 4 months later. He paused. We can't prove the death, but we can prove everything else. With what you have and what Eleanor brought out of St. Louis, we have a complete chain from Briggs down to Whitfield, down to Pruitt. He looked at Ruth steadily. I've sent a message to Daniel Reeves and Helena. He should be here in 4 days. Ruth looked at Eleanor. You carried this from St. Louis. I walked the last quarter-mile in a blizzard, Eleanor said. Ruth's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same family. Jim would have liked you, she said. Then she looked at Wade. Pruitt's man in the sheriff's office. His name is Garrett. He came in from Cheyenne 3 weeks ago, and nobody knows why, but he's been asking questions about land filings all along the Northern County Road. She folded her hands on the table. He was in here yesterday asking if I'd seen any strangers passing through. What did you tell him? I told him the only stranger I'd seen was a drummer selling boot polish who couldn't find his way out of town with both hands and a map. Ruth paused. He didn't believe me, but he also couldn't prove otherwise. He'll believe it less now that he's seen us ride in together, Wade said. Then we'd better give him something plausible to believe. Ruth stood and picked up the tin box. You two are going to sit in my dining room and have a meal like normal people, and I'm going to be heard telling my other boarders that my friend Wade brought his cousin in for a hot meal because the cousin had a difficult ride from Billings and needed feeding up. People believe what they can see. She picked up the ledger. And I'm going to go upstairs and put Jim's record somewhere that isn't my floorboard, because if Garrett decides to make a move, I want this out of my possession before he does. Where will you put them? Eleanor asked. Ruth looked at her. With you, she said. You've already carried them this far. Might as well keep going. They ate in Ruth's dining room, 2 other boarders at the table, a retired school teacher named Agnes, and a young cattle buyer from Bozeman, who talked exclusively about beef prices for 20 minutes, and then mercifully ran out of things to say. Eleanor ate and listened, and answered the 2 questions Agnes asked her about Billings, with the careful specificity of someone who had spent part of the previous afternoon preparing exactly those answers, because Wade had given her the outline on the ride in. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the door opened. She knew before she turned around. It was the quality of Wade's stillness. The sudden and absolute cessation of movement from a man who was always moving in small ways, always noting and cataloging, that told her the thing they'd been waiting for had just walked through Ruth McAllister's front door. He was medium height, 40 or so, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather and the territory, with the particular kind of eyes that moved fast and settled slow, the eyes of a man trained to observe. He stood in the doorway and looked at the dining room with one sweep, and his gaze landed on Eleanor and stayed. Afternoon, he said. To the room, but to her. Mr. Garrett, Ruth said from the kitchen doorway, her voice perfectly level. Meal service is over for today. Come back at 6 if you want supper. Garrett didn't look at Ruth. He looked at Eleanor. Don't believe we've met, ma'am. Ellie Barrett, she said. She did not offer her hand. Wade's cousin. Barrett. He repeated the way a man repeats a name he's writing down in his head. Down from Billings. That's right. Long ride in this weather? It was, she said. I don't recommend it. Garrett smiled with his mouth. His eyes were doing the inventory that Eleanor recognized from the Pinkerton description, starting at the feet and working up noting filing, concluding. She let him do it. She was wearing her plainest clothes, her hair up simply, Franklin's coat left at the boarding house bedroom Ruth had offered. She looked, she hoped, like exactly what she was claiming to be. You planning on staying long? Garrett asked. Until the road's clear enough to be worth traveling, she said. Shouldn't be more than a few days. He looked at Wade for the first time. Hartman. Weston, Wade said pleasantly. Thomas Weston. We've met twice, Garrett. I'd think you'd have it by now. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Right. Weston. He didn't apologize for the error. You hear about the woman they're looking for, posted on the telegraph pole before someone took it down? I heard something, Wade said. Murderess out of Missouri, wasn't it? St. Louis. Young woman, dark red hair, traveling alone. Garrett looked at Eleanor's hair, which was brown. She had thanked God for that brown hair every day of the last 13 days. You see anyone matching that on your way in, Miss Barrett? I didn't see much of anything on my way in except snow, Eleanor said. And a horse that had opinions about the conditions. Agnes, the schoolteacher, laughed at that because it was the kind of thing that made people laugh, and the cattle buyer from Bozeman looked up from his plate for the first time in 10 minutes. The moment shifted from interrogation to dining room, and Garrett felt it happen and didn't like it, but couldn't reverse it without making himself conspicuous. Well, he said, if you see anything, he nodded to the room and left. Nobody spoke until they heard the front door close. Agnes set down her fork. That man has been in and out of this town for 3 weeks asking everyone questions, she said with the particular indignation of a retired school teacher who had excellent instincts about people behaving badly. Ruth, who is he working for? Nobody who matters to us. Agnes, Ruth said, coming out of the kitchen with a plate. More biscuits. Agnes accepted biscuits with the expression of a woman filing the question away for later. Under the table, Wade's hand found Eleanor's wrist and pressed once brief and deliberate the pressure of a man communicating something he couldn't say out loud. She read it clearly, not yet, not here, wait. She waited. They left Ruth's boarding house 40 minutes later with Jim McAllister's ledger and letters wrapped in oilcloth inside Eleanor's saddlebag, alongside the original folder, and Ruth stood on her porch and watched them ride, and her face held everything she wasn't saying about 4 years of waiting and what it felt like to finally see it moving. They were 3 blocks from the edge of town when Eleanor heard the second set of hoofbeats behind them. Don't turn around, Wade said. I know. She kept her eyes forward. How many? 1. Started following us when we passed the hotel. He kept the same unhurried pace. Could be Garrett. Could be the man I didn't recognize this morning. What do? We ride home, he said. Exactly as we planned. If he follows us onto my property, he's trespassing, and I have the right to address that directly. His voice was quiet and entirely calm. If he stops at the property line and watches, then he's reporting back, and we have less time than I thought. They turned onto the road north, and the hoofbeats turned with them, and maintained their distance, not closing, not retreating, just following with the patient, deliberate quality of professional surveillance. He's reporting, Eleanor said. Yes. So we have less time than you thought? Yes. She absorbed this. How much less? If Garrett sends a rider to Briggs tonight, Briggs could have men here in 2 days. He paused. Which means Reeves needs to move faster than I asked him to. Can you get another message to him? Not tonight. The relay rider went this morning. He was quiet for a moment. There's another way. Ruth has a nephew and Helena works at the freight office. If she sends a wire tonight through the Bozeman relay instead of the Harlan Creek office, it bypasses Pruitt's man at the telegraph entirely. He glanced at her. I should have thought of that this morning. You were thinking about 11 other things this morning, she said. He looked at her briefly. Something in his expression shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize, the small recalibration of a man who wasn't used to being offered that kind of plain-spoken grace. I'll ride back to Ruth's tonight after dark, he said. Give her the message for her nephew. In the meantime, he looked straight ahead. When we get back to the ranch, I need you to make copies of the most critical documents, the deed transfers with Holt's notary stamp, and the 3 with Briggs' witness signature. If something happens to the originals... Nothing's going to happen to the originals, she said. Ellie. His voice was patient. If Whitfield is the man I think he is, and Briggs has told him where you are, something could very easily happen to the originals. She thought about Cole Whitfield's signature leaning hard to the right. She thought about 2 bullets in Franklin's chest and a note pinned to his jacket. She thought about Jim McAllister dying of a heart attack at 47, healthy as a man half his age. "Copies," she said. "Yes, I'll make copies." The hoofbeats behind them stopped at the property line exactly as Wade had predicted. She heard them cease and felt the absence of them like a change in pressure and resisted the urge to look back. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the one she'd ridden through for 11 days. Not the silence of a woman alone with her fear, but the silence of 2 people who had run out of words for the moment and didn't need them because the thinking was already done, and what came next was simply the work. Wade took the horses to the barn. Eleanor went inside and lit the lamp and spread the documents across the table and found paper and a pen and began to write. She wrote fast and clean, her hand steady the way she'd written everything since Cincinnati. Franklin had called her handwriting mannish, meaning it was legible, and even meaning it didn't have the decorative loops his mother's generation had been taught, meaning she had been educated to write for function and not for appearance. She was on the 6th copy when she heard Wade come in from the barn. She heard him stop in the doorway of the room. She kept writing. "How many have you done?" he asked. 6 complete sets of the Holt documents. Working on the Briggs signatures now." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him pull out the chair across the table and sit down, and when she glanced up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not the detective's evaluation, not the careful neutrality he wore in public, something quieter than either. "Ellie," he said. She kept writing. "Don't tell me to rest." "I wasn't going to." She looked up. "I was going to say, he said that whoever put that poster up with your name on it, they made a mistake, not just tactically." He looked at the copies spreading across the table, a woman's hand replicating evidence of crimes committed against 43 families, with the methodical precision of someone who intended to see every one of those crimes answered for. "They made a fundamental mistake about who you are." Eleanor Cross looked at him across a table covered in evidence in a ranch house in Montana on the 13th day of running for her life. "Yes," she said. "They did." She turned back to the page and kept writing, and outside the night settled over the property, and somewhere on the road, a man on a horse was riding back to report her location, and 4 days away, a federal marshal was reading a message that would bring him north faster than he'd planned. And in the boarding house in Harlan Creek, Ruth McAllister was composing a telegram to her nephew in Helena, in the careful, neutral language of a woman who had learned to say dangerous things in plain words. Everything was in motion now. There was no stopping it. Reeves arrived in 3 days, not 4. Eleanor heard the horses before Wade did, 2 of them moving with purpose up the northern road in the gray hour before full light, and she was already at the window when Wade came out of his room with his rifle and his boots on, and his shirt half-buttoned, and she said, "2 riders. One of them's wearing a federal badge. I can see it catching the light." Wade looked at her. "You can see a badge from this distance in this light." "Franklin had field glasses," she said. "I kept them." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd catalogued by now, the one where he recalibrated something and didn't comment on it, and went to open the door. Marshal Daniel Reeves was a tall man in his late 40s, with a gray-streaked beard and the economical movements of someone who had spent decades covering large distances efficiently. He came inside and shook Wade's hand, and then looked at Eleanor with the particular attention of a man who had read a wanted poster recently and was now performing a rapid comparison. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Marshall." "Your telegram said urgent." Wade's telegram said the same word. He sat down at the table without being invited, the way men in his profession apparently learned to treat other people's chairs. "I brought my deputy. He's outside with the horses. Tell me what you have." Eleanor put the folder on the table. Reeves opened it. He read the way Wade read carefully. Twice nothing missed, but where Wade's face stayed neutral. Reeves's face moved through a sequence of expressions that told a story of its own. Surprise controlled quickly. Recognition. Something that looked like the satisfaction of a man watching a long-held theory prove itself correct. Then a particular cold settling that Eleanor had no word for, except dangerous, the expression of a man deciding what to do with something he'd been trying to find for 2 years. "Where did your husband get these?" he asked without looking up. "I don't know exactly. He worked for Briggs's land company for 14 months before he died. I think he was copying documents when he could and building the record quietly." She paused. He wasn't a brave man in most respects, but he was meticulous. And I think at some point he understood what he was involved in and decided he wanted out, and the only currency he had was what he knew. "Did he try to contact anyone? A lawyer, a journalist, anyone in federal authority?" "Not that I know of, but I didn't know he had these documents, so." She stopped. Reeves looked up. "So he may have reached out to someone and that's what got him killed." "That's what I've been thinking for 2 weeks." Reeves looked at Wade. "The Whitfield connection." "Cole Whitfield has been Briggs' enforcer since at least 1879, Wade said. "His signature is on a deed transfer in March 1881, same month Cross started at the land company. He's Samuel Pruitt's brother-in-law. And a man named Garrett, who arrived in Harlan Creek 3 weeks ago, has been making inquiries about land filings along the Northern County Road. We believe he's Whitfield's man positioned here in advance." "In advance of what?" "In advance of this," Eleanor said. "We think Briggs knew Franklin was building a record before he killed him. He didn't know Franklin had already moved the documents, but he knew they existed, and he knew I was the most likely person to have them or find them." She kept her voice steady. "The murder charge wasn't to punish me. It was to discredit me before I could use what I was carrying." Reeves closed the folder. He put both hands flat on it. "Mrs. Cross, I've been building a case against Harold Briggs for 2 years. I have 30 pages of circumstantial evidence that is extremely compelling and entirely insufficient to bring before a federal judge without him having it buried in 3 days." He looked at her. "What you have in this folder is the difference between a case that disappears and a case that ends a political career and puts 5 men in federal prison." He paused. "Which is why I need to ask you something difficult." "Ask it." "Would you be willing to testify formally before a federal grand jury in Helena under your name on the record?" The fire crackled. Outside, the deputy moved the horses. Eleanor had known this question was coming. She'd known it the way you know a bend in the road is there before you can see it from the shape of the terrain. She'd been preparing her answer for 3 days, without letting herself think directly about it, because thinking directly about it led immediately to the image of Franklin with 2 bullets in his chest and a note that read, "This is what happens," and that image had a way of making her hands shake. "If I testify," she said, "the murder charge. We petition for dismissal based on the evidence of conspiracy and political manipulation of the judicial process," Reeves said. "With what you have here, that petition succeeds. Judge Taft's connection to Briggs is documented in these pages. Any federal judge with jurisdiction will throw out a murder charge filed through a corrupted court." He paused. "I won't pretend it's without risk. Briggs has resources, and he will use them. But the answer to that risk is moving fast and moving publicly, which is why I need your answer today." Eleanor looked at the folder under his hands. She thought about 43 families. She thought about Ruth McAllister's hand flat on the deed transfer, and the 4 years of waiting in that gesture. She thought about Jim McAllister's ledger, and the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who kept records because he believed in accountability, who died at 47 for exactly that belief. She thought about Briggs sitting in his office in Helena, comfortable and untouched, and the practiced ease with which he'd signed warrants and filed charges, and expected a woman running for her life to simply keep running until she disappeared. "Yes," she said. "I'll testify." Reeves nodded once. He reached inside his coat and put a paper on the table official seal at the top and said, Then this is a federal protection order effective immediately. You're under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Marshal's Office. That wanted poster is suspended pending judicial review. He slid it toward her. You're not a fugitive anymore, Mrs. Cross. She didn't reach for the paper immediately. She looked at it. 13 days. 11 days of riding, and 2 days in a stranger's house, and a blizzard, and a horse that quit and boot through ice, and a dining room performance, and 13 days of her face on every tree between here and St. Louis. She picked up the paper. Wade across the table didn't say anything, but she felt him watching her with the particular quality of attention he gave things that mattered. How long before we leave for Helena? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Reeves said. Before Garrett reports your location and Briggs has time to move. He looked at Wade. You'll come as witness to the chain of custody for the documents. And there's a woman, Ruth McAllister. She'll come, Wade said. Her husband's records corroborate the timeline going back to 1879. She's been waiting for this longer than any of us. Reeves stood. I'll stay the night if that's acceptable. My deputy can bunk in the barn. He picked up the folder with the careful deliberateness of a man taking possession of something he intended to keep safe. I'll need these. The originals, yes, Eleanor said. I have 6 complete sets of copies. I want 1 copy with me at all times. Reeves looked at her. You made copies. 3 nights ago, and another set yesterday at Ruth's boarding house, which she's hidden inside Jim McAllister's tin box inside the wall of her root cellar. She looked at him evenly. If something happens to the originals, we still have the case. I wasn't going to carry something this far and let it be vulnerable to a single point of failure. Reeves glanced at Wade. Wade's expression said nothing, but his eyes said something that Eleanor had started to be able to read, the quiet, particular warmth of a man who was consistently surprised by the same person and was consistently pleased to be surprised. All right, Reeves said. There was something in his voice that might have been respect if it had been louder. We ride at first light. He went outside. The door closed behind him, and the room held the silence of 2 people who had just heard the trajectory of everything change. Tomorrow, Eleanor said. Tomorrow, Wade said. She stood and moved to the window. The morning was fully light now, cold and clear, the kind of Montana day that looked peaceful from inside a warm house and would take your fingers off if you underestimated it. The deputy was watering the horses at the trough. Reeves was on the porch speaking to him in low tones. Wade, she said without turning around. After Helena, after the testimony and the petition and however long it takes. She stopped. What? I don't know where I go. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say the things she didn't want to look at directly. St. Louis isn't safe. I have no family I'd go to. I sold most of what I had in the house before I ran, because I needed the money, and I didn't know how long I'd be. She stopped again. I've been so focused on the destination that I haven't thought about what happens when I arrive there. She heard him stand, heard him cross the room. He stopped a few feet behind her, not crowding, giving her the choice of whether to turn around or not. You don't have to solve that today, he said. I know, but I've been solving things by myself for 13 days, and it's become a habit I can't turn off. She turned around. He was closer than she'd estimated, and she'd estimated correctly, which meant he was standing at exactly the right distance for a man who was being careful about something. I'm not asking you to solve it. I just needed to say it out loud to a person who would hear it as information and not as a burden. He looked at her for a long moment. You said you had no family you'd go to, he said. Not that you had no family. My sister is in Denver. We weren't close. She married a man who didn't like Franklin, and Franklin didn't like that, so. She paused. We stopped writing. Might be worth writing again, he said carefully. Under the circumstances. Might be. She looked at him. You're very good at practical solutions. Pinkerton training, he said. Reduce the problem to its components. Address each component in order. And if some components don't reduce neatly? Something moved in his expression. Those are the ones you sit with, he said, and you figure out what they're actually made of. She understood that he wasn't only talking about her sister in Denver. She was trying to find an answer to that when the sound came distant at first, then closer. The hoofbeats of more than 2 horses moving fast on the road from town. Wade was at the window in 4 steps. Eleanor was right beside him. 4 riders, coming hard from the south. That's not Pruitt's man, Wade said. Garrett had 1 horse. He turned and went to the door and called out, "Reeves." Reeves came around the side of the house at a controlled run, and he'd already read the approaching riders, and he said, "Inside. Everyone inside now," in the voice of a man who didn't say things twice. They went inside. Wade bolted the door and moved to the side window. Reeves positioned his deputy at the back. Eleanor went to the table and pulled the copy set from her saddlebag and put it inside her dress flat against her ribs, because if the originals were in this room and something happened, the copies on her body were the only thing left. "Who are they?" she asked. "Don't know yet," Wade said. He was watching through the gap in the curtain with the focused patience of a man who had done this before and knew that patience was what the moment required. "They're slowing, coming to the gate." He watched. "One of them is Garrett." "How many guns?" Reeves asked. 4 riders, 4 visible sidearms, at least 2 rifles on the saddles. Wade kept watching. "They're stopping at the gate, talking." He was quiet for a moment. "Garrett's reading the property marker." Another pause. "Reeves, the man on the gray horse at the back. You know him." Reeves came to look. He looked for exactly 2 seconds. "Cole Whitfield," he said. Eleanor's hand went to her ribs without thinking, pressing against the copies beneath her dress. Cole Whitfield. The cramped signature leaning hard to the right. The man Reeves believed had killed Franklin. Here in person on a gray horse at the gate of a ranch in Montana Territory, reading a property marker that bore the name of a former Pinkerton detective who had spent the last 4 years trying to become a different kind of man. "He didn't come here to collect me," she said. "He came here to collect the documents." "Or eliminate everyone who knows about them," Reeves said flatly. "Can you hold them off legally?" Wade asked him. "I have jurisdiction, but I have 2 guns against 4. Reeves moved to the deputy. "Williams, get to the back window, and if any of them come around the building, you announce your office, and you don't fire first. But you don't let them through." "Yes, sir." "Wade." Reeves turned. "This is your property. When they come to the door, you answer it. Marshall's jurisdiction gives me the right to be here, but it gives you the right to be heard first on your own land. Make that count." Wade nodded. He picked up his rifle with the ease of long habit and went to the door and waited. They came to the door 3 minutes later. Eleanor heard them dismount and come up the steps, and the knock had the particular quality of a knock that wasn't really a question. Wade opened the door. Garrett was in front. Whitfield was a step back and to the left, which was the position Eleanor realized of a man who was used to having someone else do his talking. "Weston," Garrett said. "We're looking for a woman." "I know what you're looking for," Wade said. "And I know who sent you." Garrett's eyes moved past him into the house. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides, the copy set pressed flat against her ribs, watching. Garrett looked at her with the same eyes he'd used in Ruth's dining room, the inventory, and then he looked at something that shifted his expression entirely. He'd seen the federal protection order on the table. "That woman," Wade said, "is under federal protection. Marshal Daniel Reeves, U.S. Marshal's office. Helena is in this room. And the man behind you on the gray horse is wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Franklin Cross in St. Louis, Missouri, which is a federal matter because it crosses 3 state lines." He said it all with the quiet precision of a man who had been a detective and knew exactly which words carried legal weight and where to place them. "Now, you can come inside and Reeves can explain the situation in full. Or you can tell Whitfield to ride and save himself what's coming. but nobody on this porch is taking anything from this house today." Garrett turned and looked at Whitfield. Whitfield had been still through all of it, the particular stillness of a man calculating, running the numbers of the situation with the professional speed of someone for whom violence was a tool he selected based on whether the conditions were right. And the conditions Eleanor could see him determining were not right. Federal marshal inside. Property owner at the door. Two sets of eyes he couldn't account for from outside. The legal protection order visible on the table. "Garrett," Whitfield said. His voice was medium weight, unremarkable. "We'll come back." "You'll come back to what?" Reeves said from behind Wade, stepping into the doorway. His badge caught the light clearly. "My jurisdiction follows you wherever you ride, Whitfield. You want to do this here or in Helena, because either way, we're doing it." Whitfield looked at Reeves. He looked at Wade. He looked last at Eleanor, and she met his eyes and didn't move and didn't look away, because she had been running from this man for 13 days, from the consequence of his work, from the threat that bore his name without his face, and she was done running, and she wanted him to be able to see that clearly. Something shifted in Whitfield's expression. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who had miscalculated the nature of what he was up against, who had expected a frightened woman with documents she didn't fully understand, and had found instead a woman standing in a doorway with a federal marshal at her back and 13 days of accumulated certainty behind her eyes. He turned his horse. "Garrett," he said. Garrett followed. The four of them rode back down the road and didn't look back, and the sound of their horses faded south toward town, and the silence they left behind was the loud, specific silence of something that wasn't over but had changed shape. Reeves exhaled slowly. "They'll regroup," he said. "He'll send word to Briggs tonight." "Then Briggs knows by morning," Wade said. "Yes, which means we leave tonight, not tomorrow." Reeves turned back inside. "How quickly can you be ready?" "An hour," Eleanor said. 45 minutes, Wade said. She looked at him. "Ruth needs warning," he said. "I'll ride to town while you pack. She needs to be ready to leave tonight with us." He looked at Reeves. "Her husband's records are in that root cellar. We're not leaving them behind." Reeves accepted this with a nod. Wade was already moving coat on and horse out of the barn inside of 4 minutes, and Eleanor watched him ride south toward Harlan Creek with the particular quality of attention she'd developed over the last 3 days, the specific, careful kind that comes from watching someone and needing them to come back. She turned to the room and began to pack. She worked with the systematic speed of someone who had already done this once under worse conditions. The copies first secured. The notebooks. The small practical inventory of what mattered and what could be left. Franklin's coat, which she folded last and set on top because she was not done with it yet, and it had carried more than its share and deserved to finish the journey it had started. She was checking the saddlebag buckles when Reeves said from across the room, "Mrs. Cross." She looked up. "The testimony you'll give in Helena," he said. "It will be hard. Briggs's lawyers will try everything they have. They'll put your marriage in front of the jury, and your husband's work, and every choice you've made in the last 2 weeks under the worst possible light." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that before you're standing in that room with no warning." "I know," she said. "And," she picked up the saddlebag, "and I've been running from men who think a woman's testimony is worth nothing for 13 days, she said. "I'd like very much to be in a room where that assumption gets tested." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I imagine you would." The door opened and Wade came back inside. Ruth McAllister 1 step behind him with a packed bag over her shoulder and Jim McAllister's tin box under her arm, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for exactly this moment and intended to show up for it with everything she had. "Horses are ready," Wade said. "We ride in 10 minutes." Eleanor Cross put on Franklin's coat, picked up her saddlebag, and walked to the door. Outside, the afternoon was tipping toward early dark, the cold coming down clean and absolute, and the road north pointed toward Helena and a federal courthouse, and everything that came after the running stopped. She didn't look back at the house. She was done looking back. They rode through the night in 2 shifts. Reeves setting the pace, and Wade riding the outside position where he could see the road behind them. And Eleanor sat her borrowed horse in the dark, and felt the copies pressed against her ribs with every stride, and thought about Franklin sewing documents into a coat lining with the particular desperation of a man who knew he was running out of time. She wondered if he'd known at the end that he'd done enough, that the thing he'd hidden would find its way to someone who could use it. She supposed she'd never know the answer to that, and she'd made a kind of peace with not knowing the way you make peace with the questions that don't have answers by deciding they don't need them. Ruth rode beside her for the first 2 hours without speaking, and Eleanor didn't push her. There was a particular kind of quiet that Ruth McAllister carried, the quiet of someone who had held something difficult alone for a very long time, and was now in the presence of people who understood the weight of it, and didn't need to explain it, and that was its own kind of relief. It was Ruth who spoke first, somewhere in the 2nd hour, her voice low and even in the dark. Jim used to say that the worst thing about injustice isn't the harm it does, it's the silence it creates around the harm. She paused. All those families who lost their land. None of them talked to each other. Each one thought they were the only one, that they'd made some mistake, that they should have fought harder. That's how men like Briggs operate. They keep everyone isolated. Not anymore, Eleanor said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. No, she said. Not anymore. They reached Helena in the late afternoon of the 2nd day, cold and road-worn, and Reeves took them directly to the Federal Building on Broadway Street, and not to a hotel first, because he understood, as Eleanor understood, that comfort was a thing that happened after, not before. And there was still a great deal of before left to get through. The federal prosecutor was a man named Arthur Lund, compact and precise, who shook Eleanor's hand the way men shook other men's hands, which she noted and appreciated, and then sat across from her for 2 hours, asking questions that cut directly to the center of every piece of evidence without wasted motion. He read the documents while she watched him, and she saw the same sequence on his face that she'd seen on Reeves's: the controlled surprise, the recognition, the cold settling of a man deciding what to do with something important. "Mrs. Cross," he said when he'd finished, "how did you know the significance of what you were carrying?" "I didn't at first," she said. "I knew it was important because my husband had hidden it. I didn't know exactly why until I had time to read it." She paused. "Then I knew what it was because I'd been paying attention for 7 years to a kind of work my husband thought I didn't understand." Lund looked at her over the documents. "He underestimated you." "Most people did," she said. "I've stopped considering it a problem and started considering it an advantage." Wade, sitting beside her, said nothing, but she felt the small shift in him, the quality of attention that she had learned to read over 4 days of proximity, the particular warmth of a man who was pleased by something and wasn't going to make a production of it. The grand jury was convened in 3 days. Those 3 days had the quality of held breath, the tense waiting of people who know the ground could shift at any moment and are watchful for the movement. Reeves kept a deputy at the hotel. Wade slept in the room next to Eleanor's, and she knew he was there because she could hear him moving sometimes in the early hours, the particular restlessness of a man whose instincts refused to rest even when his body needed to. On the 2nd night, she knocked on his door. He opened it immediately, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "I keep thinking about what Lund said," she told him. "About Briggs's lawyers. He said they'll put everything under the worst possible light." "They will," Wade said. He leaned in the doorway. "You knew that going in. Knowing it and experiencing it are different." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you afraid of?" She'd been afraid of many things in the last 2 weeks, and she'd gotten good at identifying which fears were useful and which ones were just noise, and this one she'd decided was neither. It was something else. "I'm afraid they'll make Franklin into the only story," she said. "A corrupt lawyer, his naive wife, a sordid mess of fraud and murder. and the 43 families disappear. Jim McAllister disappears. The whole machine Briggs built, they'll try to make it about one man's crimes and one woman's marriage, and nothing larger than that. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then when you testify, he said, you make it larger than that. You name every family in that folder. You read every deed transfer into the record. You make the jury see 43 separate human beings, not a category of victims. His voice was steady and certain. That's what the testimony is for Ellie. Not just to put Briggs in prison, to put every name on the record where it can't be erased. She held that for a moment. You're very good at this, she said. I spent 9 years doing the wrong version of it, he said. I've had time to think about what the right version looks like. She went back to her room and slept. The grand jury took 1 day to return an indictment. Lund came out of the chamber with the expression of a man who had aimed at something for a long time and finally hit it. And he told them that the indictment covered 16 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of federal land rights, and in the matter of Franklin Cross, 1 count of first-degree murder with Cole Whitfield, named as the principal actor, and Harold Briggs named as the directing party. Whitfield was arrested this morning in Bozeman, Reeves added with the flat satisfaction of a man reporting a completed task. He was found in possession of correspondence from Briggs that corroborates your documents in 3 specific particulars. He looked at Eleanor. He is going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Ruth sat down in the nearest chair. She sat very still for a moment, and then she put her face in her hands. Not crying exactly something more complicated than crying the release of something that had been held under pressure for 4 years, and was now finally allowed to come down. Eleanor sat beside her, and put her arm around her, and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and Ruth didn't need adequate. She needed exactly this, someone beside her present, not rushing her through it. Wade stood across the room and gave them the space of it, and Eleanor looked at him over Ruth's shoulder, and he looked back at her, and in that exchange was everything that the last 4 days had built between them, the particular intimacy of 2 people who had done something hard together and come out the other side still standing, still facing the same direction. The formal trial of Harold Briggs began 6 weeks later, which Lund said was extraordinarily fast for a case of this complexity, and which Eleanor understood meant that the evidence was so complete that delay served no one except the defense. She testified on the 3rd day. She had thought about what Wade said every single day of those 6 weeks. She had written and rewritten what she would say, not to memorize it, but to understand it the way you understand something by writing it down, until it becomes part of the way you think, and not just something you remember. She had gone through every name in the folder, all 43, and she had found records for 31 of them, newspaper items and county records, and in some cases, letters that Lund's office had gathered once the indictment opened the investigation formally. Families broken up. Properties sold at 1/3 of value. A water source taken from a widow in Harlan Creek by a deed filed in a dead woman's maiden name. She carried all of it onto the stand with her. Briggs's lawyer was named Harmon Vale, and he was very good, which Lund had warned her about. He was the kind of lawyer who worked through implication rather than accusation, building a picture of a woman who had been ignorant of her husband's crimes until they became inconvenient, who had then fled with evidence she barely understood, who had attached herself to a former Pinkerton agent with his own complicated history, and whose testimony was the product of 13 days of running and the particular story a desperate woman tells herself to make her circumstances bearable. He was very good at it. And Eleanor Cross, who had read 4 shelves of law books while her husband thought she was reading novels, was better. Mrs. Cross, Vale said on his 3rd pass at her credibility, "Isn't it true that you had no formal legal training?" "That's correct," she said. "And yet you're asking this court to accept your interpretation of complex land transfer documents as reliable evidence." "I'm asking this court to read the documents themselves," she said. "My interpretation is in my testimony. The documents speak without my assistance." She looked at him steadily. "The notary stamp on page 14 is R.C. Holt, Aldrich Stone's brother-in-law. That fact requires no interpretation. It requires literacy." A sound ran through the gallery. Vale moved on. He came at her twice more, circling the question of motive, why she'd run, whether she'd known about Franklin's crimes, whether the marriage had been what she claimed. And each time she answered him with the precision she'd developed over 6 weeks of preparation and 7 years of paying attention to a profession she'd never been invited into. "Mrs. Cross." Vale's voice took on the gentling tone that Eleanor had come to recognize as the precursor to his sharpest questions. "Would you describe your marriage as a happy one?" She looked at him. "No," she said. A silence in the room. "Would you describe your husband as an honest man?" "No," she said again. "He was not honest with me about the nature of his work or the people he worked for. He was not honest about what he knew and when he knew it." She paused. "He was also at the end a man who spent months secretly documenting crimes that could have destroyed him to expose. He hid that documentation in the only place he thought was safe, and he died before he could use it." She looked at the jury. "I don't know what word to use for a man who does the wrong things for a long time, and then at the last possible moment tries to make it right. But I know that his attempt to make it right is what brought every piece of evidence before this court, and 43 families are in the record today because he made it." Vale had no follow-up question. Lund did not need one. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Harold Briggs was found guilty on 14 of 16 counts. The 2 counts they reduced were procedural reductions that Lund said were standard and changed nothing of substance. The sentencing was set for 30 days out, and Lund told Eleanor in the corridor afterward that he expected 20 years minimum on the federal fraud counts alone. She stood in the corridor of the Helena Federal Courthouse with the verdict still settling around her like dust after a fall, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its completeness that it was over. The running was over. The carrying was done. The folder had traveled from Franklin's coat lining to a grand jury indictment to a federal conviction, and she had been the instrument of that journey, and the journey was finished and she was still standing. Ruth found her first. She came through the courthouse doors, and she looked like a woman who had set down something very heavy after a very long time of carrying it, which was exactly what she was. She took Eleanor's hands in both of hers and held them, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Jim's name is in the federal record now," she said finally. "His letters, his ledger. 31 families named on the record. That man from Cheyenne, the one who notarized the false deeds, he's going to prison too?" She squeezed Eleanor's hands. "It's done." "It's done," Eleanor said. Wade was the last one out of the courthouse. He'd testified the day before Eleanor giving the chain of evidence, and his 8 months of observation with the particular precision of a man who understood that a jury trusted specific facts and distrusted general impressions. Lund had told her afterward that Wade's testimony was the strongest corroborating framework the prosecution had, the thing that turned Eleanor's evidence from the account of a single witness into a documented pattern. He came through the doors and stopped on the top step and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them was maybe 15 feet, and neither of them crossed it. Immediately, just stood in the cold Helena afternoon with the verdict behind them and everything that came next still undefined. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He came down the steps toward her and stopped when he was close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. "Lund says the murder charge petition goes before a judge next week. Given the evidence of Taft's corruption and the Whitfield arrest, he says dismissal is a certainty." "I know. He told me." "So?" Wade looked at her. "What do you do now, Ellie Barrett from Billings?" She had thought about this. She'd had 6 weeks to think about it, and she'd thought about it carefully in the systematic way he'd taught her by example: reduce the problem to its components, address each component in order. Her sister in Denver. The letter she'd written 3 weeks ago and sent and received a response to that, had been short and careful, and had ended with, "I would be glad to see you." The small amount of money she'd managed to keep through 13 days of running, the skills she'd developed over 7 years of reading law books and 6 weeks of preparing federal testimony, and a lifetime of paying attention in rooms where she wasn't expected to. She'd thought about all of it, and then she'd thought about something else. "I sent a letter to the Denver Tribune 2 weeks ago," she said, "about the land fraud, the 43 families, the way the operation worked, the shell companies, the notary scheme, the political connections." She paused. "They wrote back. They want to publish it. Not as a news item, as a full account under my name." Wade looked at her. "Under Eleanor Cross." "Under Eleanor Cross." She met his eyes. Briggs ran this operation because he counted on the people he was harming not having a mechanism to be heard. A federal verdict is one kind of mechanism. A newspaper account that other people in other territories can read and recognize and use to identify the same pattern being run against them is another kind. She paused. "I don't want to be the last person who does this. I want there to be a record anyone can find." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to Denver." "For now," she said. "The Tribune has offered me a position. Not reporting, I don't have training for that. Research and documentation for land rights cases. There are lawyers there working on similar fraud cases in Colorado, and they need people who can read complex deed transfers and identify patterns across jurisdictions." She paused. "Apparently that's a skill that's in short supply." "It's in short supply," he agreed, "because most people with that skill aren't expected to develop it." She looked at him. He looked at. There was so much in that sentence, and he'd said it simply the way he said everything that mattered without decoration as plain fact, which was the way things had to be said between two people who had decided somewhere along the way to be honest with each other regardless of the cost. "Wade," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it's permanent. I'm saying I have somewhere to go and something to do and a reason to be somewhere other than the road." She held his eyes. "And I'm saying that Harlan Creek is not very far from Denver when the road is clear." He was still for a moment. The Helena afternoon was cold and bright around them, Ruth a few yards away in conversation with Reeves, the deputy holding horses at the post, people moving in and out of the courthouse behind them, with the ordinary business of the law continuing past the conclusion of the extraordinary. "No," he said finally. "It's not very far. And a man who spent 4 years trying to figure out how to be different than the man who filed those reports," she said carefully, "might find that the work I'm going to Denver to do has some relevance to that project." Something moved in his face. The careful neutrality that was his default expression shifted into something that had been visible before in the barn, when he'd given her the federal protection order in the kitchen, when he'd said they made a fundamental mistake about who you are in every moment, when he'd stopped pretending that this was a simple matter of evidence and chain of custody, and had allowed it to be what it actually was. Two people finding each other in the middle of something hard, and discovering that the finding was not incidental to the hardness, but because of it. "Ellie," he said. "I'm not asking for a promise," she said. "I know what promises cost, and I'm not handing them out lightly either." She reached into her coat and pulled out one of the 6 copy sets she'd made in his kitchen 3 weeks ago, slightly worn at the folds from constant handling, and held it out to him. "I'm asking you to keep a copy, so there's always one with someone I trust." He took it from her. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The accumulated weight of 43 families and a dead man's coat and 13 days of road and 2 nights of working the same problem from the same side across a kitchen table in a blizzard. "I'll keep it safe," he said. "I know you will," she said. "You've been keeping things safe since the moment I fell through your door." He put the copies inside his coat against his chest, where they sat beside everything else he was carrying. The guilt that had made him quit the 4 years of trying, the 8 months of watching and waiting for the peace that would make it matter, and now this. The fact of a woman who had walked into his house and handed him the reason all of it had been worth doing. Ruth came to stand beside them. "Reeves says the stage to Denver leaves tomorrow morning," she said, looking at Eleanor with the direct warmth she'd shown since the first morning in her kitchen. "I'm going back to Harlan Creek." She paused. "There's work to do there. The families along the northern road need to know about the verdict, and someone needs to make sure the land office actually processes the reversals when Lund's office files them." Her voice was practical and absolutely certain. "I've been the person in that town who knows what's happening for 4 years. Might as well be useful about it." "Ruth," Eleanor said. "Don't get weepy on me," Ruth said. But she pulled Eleanor into an embrace that had nothing careful about it, the full strength of a woman who had waited 4 years and survived it, and was now standing in the aftermath with her husband's name in the federal record and the men responsible on their way to prison. "You come back through Harlan Creek," she said against Eleanor's shoulder. "When the road's clear, you come back through." "I will," Eleanor said. Ruth released her and nodded, once the same decisive nod Eleanor had seen that first morning, and turned to say something to Reeves. And Eleanor looked at Wade, and he looked at her. And for a moment, the whole complicated weight of the last 3 weeks was simply present between them. No words needed, no resolution, just the acknowledgement that something real had happened and would continue to happen in whatever form the next chapter took. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. He rode with her to the stage station the next day, both of them quiet in the cold early light, their horses moving at the easy pace of people who are not hurrying because the destination is fixed, and what matters is what happens on the way there. Ruth had already left. Reeves had left the night before. The city was waking up around them, with the ordinary sounds of ordinary life, which felt after everything, like the most remarkable thing Eleanor had encountered in weeks. At the stage station, he helped her with the bag which she didn't need but accepted, and they stood beside the stage with the other passengers boarding around them, and the time running down to something that had to be said. "The article in the Tribune," he said, "when it's published." "I'll send you a copy," she said. "I want to read how you tell it." She looked at him. "I'm going to tell it plainly," she said. "The way it happened. A woman ran from a murder charge she didn't earn and fell through a stranger's door in a blizzard." She paused. "And the stranger turned out to be exactly the right person to fall toward." Something in his face opened and closed in the span of a second, and she saw it fully. The particular expression of a man who has spent 4 years carrying guilt for who he was and is being told plainly and without performance that who he is now is exactly what was needed. It was not a small thing to give a person. She knew that. She gave it anyway. He took her hand. Not the brief functional pressure from under Ruth's dining room table, but fully his fingers around hers, and he held it for a moment that was longer than goodbye and shorter than the conversation they hadn't finished yet but would. "Don't disappear," he said. "I never disappear," she said. "I move forward." The stage driver called the final boarding, and she picked up her bag and climbed the step, and found her seat, and the door closed, and the stage moved, and she looked through the small window at Wade Weston standing at the station with his hat in his hand, and the copy set inside his coat, and 4 years of trying to be different behind him, and whatever came next in front of him, and she looked at him until the road curved and the station disappeared. And then she turned forward. She had an article to write. She had 43 names to put into print, where they could not be erased. She had a sister in Denver who had written, "I would be glad to see you," and meant it, and a position with lawyers who needed someone who could read the patterns that powerful men made when they thought no one was paying attention. And she had pressed flat against her ribs in the inner pocket of Franklin's coat, the last copy of the documents she'd carried out of street. Louis on the worst night of her life, not as evidence anymore because the evidence was already in the federal record where it belonged, but as something else now. As proof. Not of fraud, not of conspiracy, not of the crimes of Harold Briggs, or the reach of Cole Whitfield's ambition. Proof of what a woman could do when she stopped running toward survival and started running toward something worth the effort of getting there. Eleanor Grace Cross rode the stage south out of Helena, With that knowledge settled in her chest like a foundation solid and permanent, the kind of thing that doesn't move when the ground does, and the cold Montana morning opened wide ahead of her. And she was not afraid. She had never been the woman on that poster. She had always been this one. The one who read everything, noticed everything, carried what needed carrying, and walked through whatever door was in front of her, even when her arm gave out and she fell straight through. Especially then.